fair to say, I'm just looking at the story again now and trying to understand how big a deal this is when as it applies to Canada. So the chances are in the months since Donald Trump came into power, you've probably heard the word potash mentioned more than you ever have before. It's funny because in Canada, this is big, big business, but I never realized just how big it is compared to, or at least when it comes to do with the United States, because they're, of course, our biggest export market. And now it's one of those things that's being sort of tossed around here as to whether it gets tariffed, doesn't get tariffed. So we thought we'd try to find out more. Corey Rosenbusch is CEO of the Fertilizer Institute, an advocacy group with a mission to empower the fertilizer industry. And he is actually, as we speak, I think, in Washington, right?
Yep, that is correct.
Okay.
Hey, good afternoon. I am on Capitol Hill as we speak. I just stepped out of a meeting with our House Ag Committee leader.
So explain, trying to understand, as I said earlier, what's going on, what's tariffed, what's not tariffed is difficult enough. But when it comes to potash, when it comes to Canada, it seems we have a little bit of power here. So what is the situation as it stands right now?
Well, potash is one of the most important crop nutrients, obviously nitrogen, phosphate being the other two. And when it comes to the American farmer, we depend heavily on potash from Canada. Canada is the world's largest producer of potash, and 87% of the potash that we import comes from Canada, mainly from potash mines in Saskatchewan. And so the conversation around tariffs really spooked a lot of growers going into spring planting season, and it's been a bit of a whirlwind the last month. Last week, I still am pinching myself that there was an executive order in a discussion on potash in the Oval Office. And so I'm sure you probably read that potash got some favorable treatment from the president, and that any product that's not USMCA certified, which we believe all of the potash coming out of Canada is, would of course enjoy a 0% tariff. And if it was not, potash would be 10%, which is significantly less than the 25% tariff currently in place for all non-USMCA compliant products. I know that's all very confusing.
It is.
Frankly speaking, the industry is trying to figure it out.
So, let's try to explain this to people listening. The idea that, if it's outside of the USMCA agreement, right? And you said most of it, if not all of it, is in that agreement. Who's selling it outside of that agreement?
Well, obviously all of the Canadian product would be in that agreement, but our other large potash suppliers would be Russia. That would be number 2, and Belarus number 3. So those are, two significant players in the potash market globally. And of course, we did not exempt those products. We didn't put any restrictions on those coming in after Russia invaded Ukraine, but it does create a little bit of a security question, which is why Canadian potash is so important.
So what was the message? So you're representing American farmers here. What's your message been and continuing to be to the president? Leave things as they stand?
Well, honestly, we were asking for a complete exemption of all fertilizer products. We also have a number of nitrogen plants that are in Canada that serve because natural gas is the key feedstock for nitrogen fertilizers, and as you think about where natural gas is, it's critical to import some of that nitrogen product into our northern tier states, and the growers in North Dakota, Minnesota, even out west in the Pacific Northwest is important. Sulfur, 20% of the sulfur that we use in the United States, another important crop nutrient, also comes from Canada. So our message was, let's take fertilizer off the table. It's critical to farmers. Farmers, of course, are a major constituency of the president. And going into spring planting season, we didn't want to see significant market disruption.
So your understanding as it is right now is there, as you just outlined, there will be no tariff on anything in the USMCA agreement. That's the latest you have from the president, and outside of that, it would be 10% instead of 25%. Is that right?
So 0% for anything within.
Right. That's
any product, including fertilizer. Only potash and oil and gas gets the 10% benefit. Everything else is either 0% if it's within the USMCA agreement, or it's 25%.
Okay. Well, you're right about the part about being confusing, so I give you credit for that. Just
hire an attorney to explain
yeah.
it to you.
Wow. So as of today, you said you're on Capitol Hill right now. Is that because you think he could change his mind at any point, or what's the rationale?
Well, we're constantly engaged, with the members of Congress, just continuing to educate them, especially the members on our Ag Committee. Like I said, at the end of the day, this is about ensuring that U.S. farmers are able to get the crop nutrients they need. So they're an important constituent. I mean, the president has great relationships with members of Congress, and when they're having conversations with them, particularly those that are in major ag districts, we want to make sure they're also joining us in telling this story.
I would just ask one last thing. You've obviously heard from American farmers when the story first came up. How serious was the concern that there would be a tariff?
Honestly, it was not. That was part of our scramble. We represent the fertilizer industry, and this was not on the farmer's radar.
Mm-hmm.
A farmer does not necessarily know that 87% of their potash comes from Canada. They know that it comes out of their local ag retailer's shed. And so that point of origin and where that product is sourced from is not necessarily something the average farmer would understand. And I would say, generally speaking, they have a high trust for the president. I was with a big group of farmers at our Commodity Classic last week, and their confidence in what the president is doing is very high, and they have a high degree of trust. Until that hits their input cost, it is not something that's going to be high on their list of concerns right now, and so that's why we kind of had to raise the flag on behalf of the industry, because we didn't necessarily have a crisis brewing among the farming community to where they were starting to shout about it.
Just as a last question, that aside, the Canadian potential tariffs aside, what about what China is doing with respect to the farming industry in the U.S. and all the tariffs they're now imposing?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it gets a little bit outside my expertise because I'm not on the commodity side of the business, but obviously they're a huge buyer for Canadian grain, for U.S. grain, and a major trading partner. And so that's where a lot of that negotiation exists. From a fertilizer perspective, China significantly disrupted the market about 3 years ago, and we saw these 300% increases in fertilizer prices across the world, even for Canadian or African or European farmers, because as the world's largest manufacturer of all fertilizers, China would be right after Belarus on the potash list. They decided to block all of their exports. So they no longer supply the world with any fertilizer product. They decided to keep it all internally for their own farmers' use and create quite a bit of disruption. So tariffs from a Chinese perspective on fertilizer doesn't really impact the global market right now.
All right, we'll leave it at that. I thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Corey Rosenbusch, he is CEO of the I can't say that word, the Fertilizer Institute. The Fertilizer Institute. And so far, potash seems to be protected.